I'm Carolyn Mercer, 33 years old, and though I've spent the last decade building a hotel empire from scratch, I've never once been treated as worthy by my own family. On the evening of my father's 65th birthday, I walked toward the glass doors of the most exclusive hotel in the city, Athena on Fifth, every detail inside designed and paid for by me. My sister Lauren blocked the doorway with that same condescending grin I'd known since childhood, whispering that I couldn't afford to belong here. My mother joined in with her quiet warning not to cause a scene, as if my very presence was shameful. And just before I could respond, the elevator doors opened and my father's boss stepped out, looking directly at me with the kind of respect that froze the room. By the end of that night, nothing in our family would ever be the same. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to fight for recognition when those closest to you refuse to see your worth. I grew up in the Mercer household where appearances meant everything and loyalty to family structure was expected above all else. My father, Richard, was disciplined and detached, a man who planned his own birthday dinners months ahead and required everyone to show up polished and proper. My mother, Diane, devoted herself to curating his world every detail, from the table flowers to the stories told in public, was designed to reflect well on him. Lauren, 4 years younger than me, became the pride of the family. She was praised for her charm, her degrees, her early success as a corporate attorney in New York. Every holiday letter, every church conversation, every social introduction included her shining achievements. My name barely made it in as a footnote. From the outside, people would have said we were close-knit, but inside our home, the differences were clear. Lauren was the star, while I was the question mark, the one who didn't follow the predictable path of advanced degrees, prestigious firms, or early marriage. Instead, I packed 2 bags, left home quietly, and started working the night desk at a roadside inn hundreds of miles away. My parents assumed I was folding towels or serving coffee, and they told relatives as much. They never asked for more detail. Never wondered if there was more to my life than the small picture they had drawn. In truth, those years were the beginning of a long climb that no one in my family ever witnessed. I worked every position in the hotel business, from housekeeping to catering, saving every dollar I could. While Lauren's promotions were announced with champagne toasts, I was signing contracts to save failing inns from closure, teaching myself finance and marketing after midnight, and putting everything I had into crumbling buildings no one else believed in. I never called home to share the victories because I already knew how the conversation would go. My family never saw me as capable, so I let them carry on with their assumptions. When I bought Athena on Fifth, it was nothing more than a broken-down shell. The marble floors were cracked, the roof leaked, and weeds pushed through shattered windows. But I saw something there potential worth fighting for. I poured myself into that building, overseeing every restoration detail until it gleamed again. Guests walked into polished stone velvet drapes, a rooftop garden, and dining rooms filled with warmth. It became one of the most celebrated boutique hotels in the state, but my name stayed off the press releases. That was by choice. I didn't need public praise. I only needed to know I had done it on my own. Which is why when Lauren booked my father's birthday at Athena without realizing who owned it, I said nothing. I didn't remind her. I didn't correct her. I simply made sure the evening would be flawless, down to the bourbon I had imported just for my father. Still, when I received the group text from Lauren with nothing but the time, the dress code, and a warning not to make the night about me, the old ache returned. I wasn't even sent a real invitation to my own property. On the night of the dinner, I stepped through those glass doors in a black gown that echoed against the marble floor. My sister stood ready with her familiar smirk, prepared to put me back in my place. My mother's tight smile carried its usual warning not to embarrass anyone, But before they could press me further, the man who controlled my father's career appeared, and with a single word of respect, the room fell still. What came next would change the balance in our family forever. Growing up in the Mercer household meant every role was already scripted, and mine was always the quiet one in the background. My father, Richard, believed order was the measure of a good family, and he expected everything to run on his schedule. He organized holidays, like business meetings, mapping out the meals, the dress code, and the seating arrangement weeks ahead of time. My mother, Diane, carried out those plans with precision, making sure the centerpiece matched the tablecloth and the desserts arrived exactly when he wanted them. If something strayed from the plan, the air in the room would grow tight until silence restored the order. My sister Lauren never had to worry about fitting into that world because she was always at the center of it. She was praised for her easy smile, her sharp grades, her natural confidence that filled any room. When she won awards in school, the living room mantelpiece was rearranged so every guest could see. At church, our parents told stories about her debates and volunteer hours with such pride that people believed she was bound for something extraordinary. And in the end, they were right. She landed a career as a corporate attorney in New York before turning 30. For them, she was proof that the Mercer family produced excellence. I was treated differently. My name was rarely spoken with pride. When relatives asked how I was doing, my mother would answer with something vague like, "Caroline's busy with hotels," and quickly steer the conversation back to Lauren's accomplishments. If anyone pressed further, the response was polite but dismissive, as though what I was doing barely counted. There were never long phone calls to check on me, never cards with congratulations, never extra money sent when times were lean. Meanwhile, my parents helped Lauren with her rent when she struggled in New York, and they proudly shared her promotions on social media. I remember sitting at family dinners where Lauren's seat was always next to my father, close enough to laugh at his jokes or show him her latest paper. My spot was further down, tucked between cousins or younger family members, expected to stay quiet and smile politely. The message was never spoken outright, but I heard it clearly anyway. I was the one they didn't quite understand, the one who didn't follow the path they trusted. Looking back, I don't think it was rebellion that made me leave home. It was necessity. At 22, I packed 2 duffel bags and a second-hand laptop into the back seat of my old car, said a plain goodbye over breakfast, and drove away without anyone stopping me. There was no long hug at the door, no tearful farewell. My father barely looked up from his paper, and my mother reminded me to drive safe before moving on with her day. That was the extent of it. The first job I found was at a roadside inn just outside Denver. The sign flickered, the carpet smelled like smoke, and I was paid little more than minimum wage to work the night desk. I cleaned rooms when staff didn't show up, brewed stale coffee for tired travelers, and stayed awake with one eye on the parking lot, hoping the wrong kind of guest didn't walk in. But during those quiet hours at the desk, when the lobby was empty, I started teaching myself what made businesses survive. I studied margins, supply costs, and marketing strategies on that old laptop, taking notes long after midnight when no one else cared. No one from home asked how I was managing. At Thanksgiving, I called in from the desk phone and listened to the clatter of plates and laughter in the background. When I missed Christmas to cover another shift, my mother told the family I was stuck helping with laundry at the hotel. That became the story they carried forward, and no one asked if there was more to it. I let them believe it because explaining my choices felt pointless. They had already decided who I was. By 25, I had saved enough to invest in a small inn that was close to being shut down. The walls were chipped, the plumbing was bad, and most investors thought it was a waste of money. But I put everything I had into it late nights, constant negotiations, and endless trial and error. When the inn finally turned a profit, I bought out my partner quietly. My parents didn't know. Instead, They were busy celebrating Lauren's promotion to senior associate at her law firm, hosting a dinner with friends to mark the milestone. My success didn't have a seat at that table. The silence stretched on for years. While I was repairing roofs, learning how to negotiate vendor contracts, and building my reputation in the hospitality world, the Mercers were filling Christmas letters with Lauren's accomplishments. She was featured in the local newsletter, mentioned by name in church announcements, and praised by neighbors who only heard one side of the story. When people asked about me, my mother shrugged, offering vague words about how I was trying something different. I never corrected them. I didn't tell them when I bought my second property or when I finally signed the deed to Athena on 5th, the crumbling building I turned into one of the most sought-after hotels in the state. That building was filled with broken glass ivy, crawling through shattered windows and chandeliers, hanging like forgotten relics. Where others saw failure, I saw potential. I hired craftsmen to restore it, picked the art myself, curated the wine cellar, and designed it so every guest felt cared for from the moment they arrived. When it opened, it quickly became known for its beauty and service, attracting guests from across the country. Still, my parents didn't know it was mine. They once sent me an article about that charming Art Deco hotel downtown, speaking about it with admiration. My mother said the owners must be brilliant to have restored something so elegant. I smiled, knowing they were talking about me, but I didn't correct her. That silence carried into every holiday, every family gathering. While Lauren's life was displayed like a trophy, mine was treated as a vague footnote. The difference between us was never just about careers or choices. It was about being seen and valued, something I had learned not to expect. So when Lauren chose Athena on 5th as the venue for our father's birthday, without realizing I owned it, I stayed quiet. I let the arrangements unfold as if I were only another guest. I gave instructions to Marcy, my assistant manager, making sure every detail would be flawless for the evening. I even arranged for my father's favorite bourbon to be delivered, because despite everything, I still wanted the night to be special for him. I didn't plan to make a scene, but I knew what that dinner represented. For years, I had lived as the afterthought in their carefully curated world, ignored while building something they now admired without knowing. That night would reveal everything, not because I announced it, but because the truth had grown too large to remain hidden. And as I prepared to step into the dining room they thought belonged only to them, I carried with me the weight of every silence, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked. Soon those unspoken years would finally meet the light. Silence became the constant thread tying me to my family, a kind of emptiness that grew heavier as the years passed. I worked holidays without recognition, watched milestones go unnoticed, and listened to relatives repeat half-truths about my life because my parents never offered more. When I stayed in Denver to keep a hotel running through a winter storm, my absence at Christmas was described as me helping fold towels. That phrase seemed to follow me around, echoing through family gatherings, as though it defined my place in the world. It didn't matter that by then I was signing contracts and managing payrolls. In their eyes, I was still the girl cleaning up after others. During those years, I learned how to live with the distance. My phone rarely rang with their voices on the other end, and when it did, the conversations were short, centered on Lauren's career. My father spoke proudly of her courtroom victories. My mother bragged about her firm's high-profile clients. And when the subject turned toward me, it slipped away quickly. Caroline's busy with hotels, they would say, before moving on to something they valued more. I didn't fight to be heard. I simply poured myself back into the work that demanded everything I had. The truth was, success came at a cost. I lived in small apartments near whatever property I was trying to save, eating late-night takeout between meetings with bankers who doubted me. I stayed awake long after midnight learning how to read financial reports by the glow of my laptop. There were weeks when I wondered if the bills would ever balance, and mornings when I questioned whether I had chosen the harder path for nothing. But in the quiet, without applause or encouragement, I kept going. No one in my family noticed the long hours or the strain, and in a way that made it easier. I didn't need to prove myself to them. When the proof was in the walls, I restored the guests I welcomed and the paychecks I signed. The silence from home never softened. When I bought into my first real property, there was no phone call from my parents to congratulate me. When the inn reopened under my care, no card arrived in the mail. Lauren had dinners thrown in her honor for passing exams, while I sat alone at a small desk, writing new schedules for staff and trying to keep the lights on. The distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional, stretching wider every year. I learned to adapt. When my mother sent articles about hotels she thought were charming, unaware they were mine, I smiled privately and said nothing. When my father talked about the importance of real careers, I listened quietly, even as I was signing contracts that proved him wrong. They didn't see me, and I stopped expecting them to. Instead, I let the silence fill the space between us, building my life in the shadows they had pushed me into. That choice shaped me more than I realized at the time. I stopped waiting for recognition that never came, and I started trusting the quiet work to speak for itself. I didn't announce when I paid off a loan early or when I secured a permit after months of negotiation. I celebrated those victories alone, raising a glass in the dim light of my office, knowing no one else would mark the moment. Each success felt like a small step forward, even if no one at home ever knew. But the quiet wasn't always easy to carry. There were nights when exhaustion settled heavy on my shoulders, and I wondered what it might feel like to have even one person believe in me. I didn't expect praise, but I longed for acknowledgement, for someone to ask what I was building and listen long enough to hear the answer. Instead, the silence stayed. At family gatherings, I sat in the background, smiling politely, listening to stories about Lauren's promotions and achievements. When someone asked about me, the answer was short, a polite nod to a life they never cared to understand. I told myself it didn't matter, and most days it didn't. I kept working, kept building, kept moving forward. The properties grew one after another until Athena on 5th became my crown jewel. Still, I never heard a word from my family that suggested they knew or cared. The silence remained as steady and familiar as ever. That was the world I carried into the night of my father's birthday. They chose my hotel without realizing it was mine, arranging every detail as though I had no part in it. I wasn't formally invited, just included in a group message with instructions not to be late. Even then, there was no greeting, no warmth, no sense that my presence was wanted. I was tolerated as I always had been, and yet I showed up. I walked through the doors of Athena not as a guest, but as the woman who had built it from nothing. The silence of those years followed me into the lobby, pressing against me like a familiar weight. But this time, the quiet would not last. The truth held back for so long was waiting for its moment to be heard. Athena on 5th was more than just another property in my portfolio. It was the place that tested me in every possible way, the project no one believed could succeed. When I first stepped into the abandoned building, broken glass covered the floor. Ivy crept through shattered windows, and the air smelled of mildew and dust. The chandeliers, once grand, hung like forgotten ornaments, and the marble beneath my feet was cracked and worn. Most people saw a shell destined for demolition. I saw a chance to breathe life into something everyone else had written off. I poured everything into that restoration. I hired local craftsmen to restore the stonework-sourced velvet drapes in deep navy and tracked down brass fixtures from an old foundry in Chicago. Every corner of that building held a piece of me. Long nights spent reviewing blueprints, countless hours meeting with contractors, and endless days fighting to secure financing from banks that doubted my vision. I walked the halls while construction was still underway, notebook in hand, picturing how guests would feel when they stepped inside. When the doors finally opened again, Athena didn't whisper of its past. It declared its return with elegance and strength. The reviews came quickly. Guests praised the polished marble floors, the rooftop garden glowing with string lights, and the wine cellar I had spent years curating. Industry critics called it one of the finest boutique hotels in the region. Celebrities booked stays quietly, and consultants from prestigious dining guides took notice of the kitchen. But despite the recognition, I chose to keep my name out of the spotlight. The hotel was known for its beauty, not for its owner. That was how I wanted it. The irony never escaped me. My family, who spent years dismissing me, spoke with admiration about Athena without realizing it belonged to me. My mother once forwarded me an article praising the charming Art Deco hotel downtown, adding that the owners must be very talented. I read her message twice before setting my phone aside. She didn't know, and I didn't correct her. I let the silence remain. So when Lauren chose Athena for our father's birthday celebration, I kept my distance. I didn't announce that the venue was mine. I didn't remind her that she hadn't asked. Instead, I called Marcy into my office and gave her instructions. The dining suite would be prepared to perfection. My father's favorite bourbon, flown in from Kentucky white orchids arranged for the centerpiece, and a menu tailored to his tastes. The family would be treated like honored guests, though they had no idea whose home they were entering. Lauren was relentless with the planning, calling Marcy repeatedly with last-minute changes. She adjusted the floral arrangements 3 times, complained about the per-head price, and even requested a vegetarian amuse-bouche that felt elevated but didn't involve mushrooms. Marcy relayed each demand with a faint smile, waiting for my reaction. I simply nodded, knowing my team could handle it. My mother called too, requesting that a staff member take photos of the family during dinner. "Nothing too staged," she said, before adding quietly, "and if Caroline attends, please don't focus on her. It's complicated." Marcy hesitated before repeating that line to me, her eyes flicking up to gauge my reaction. I thanked her for passing it along and moved on. The night before the event, I stood alone on the rooftop garden. The tables were already set with linens pressed crisp and glassware gleaming under soft lights. The city stretched around me, a view I had claimed after years of being told I wouldn't amount to anything. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my notebook, the same one I carried through the renovations. On the first page of a new entry, I wrote a simple sentence: "Being underestimated has a cost." I closed it without adding more, because I didn't need to explain it. I didn't know exactly how the next evening would unfold. Part of me considered walking in dressed sharply, making a statement no one could ignore. Another part of me, the side that had grown stronger with time, believed the moment would come without theatrics. Either way, the truth was about to step out of the shadows. The official invitation never came, only a forwarded message from Lauren with details about the start time and a reminder not to make the night about me. I read it twice, the words plain on the screen. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement, just instructions. For a long time I stared at the message, then set my phone aside. They still didn't see me. They had no idea what they were about to walk into. On the night of the dinner, I chose not to slip in quietly through the staff entrance. Instead, I walked up the main steps as any guest would, the click of my heels sharp against the marble. I wore a tailored black gown with a high neckline and a low back, simple yet commanding. The lobby glowed with candlelight reflecting off polished walls, a string quartet filling the air with gentle music. Guests moved easily through the space, glasses of champagne in hand, never knowing the woman passing among them had built it all. Marcy greeted me at the desk with a discreet nod. "They've arrived," she whispered. "Lauren has already complained about the lighting." I smiled faintly and thanked her, then moved toward the dining wing. Just as I turned the corner, Lauren appeared in a green satin dress, her expression tightening when she saw me. "You're really here," she said, her voice edged with disbelief. "Of course," I answered evenly. "It's Dad's night." She crossed her arms, glancing around as though searching for backup. "You can't just walk in uninvited." "I'm not crashing," I replied calmly. "This is my hotel." Lauren laughed sharp and dismissive. "Your hotel. You can't even afford to eat here." Her words lingered, cutting the air between us. Before I could respond, our mother joined us, clutching her purse tightly. She didn't say hello, didn't ask how I'd been. Instead, she leaned close and whispered, "Don't embarrass your father tonight, please." I held her gaze, hearing the weight of years in those few words. Then movement at the entrance drew my eyes. Edward Callahan, my father's boss, stepped through the revolving door, his coat draped neatly over his arm. Lauren kept talking, unaware, but he was already looking past her. His eyes found mine, and his expression shifted to recognition. "Miss Mercer," he said with a slight bow, his voice carrying across the lobby. "I didn't expect to see you here." Lauren froze. My mother blinked, caught off guard. Callahan smiled warmly. "Thank you again for hosting us in such a remarkable place." Then loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, he added, "Good evening, ma'am." The word echoed against marble and glass, settling over the room like a final chord. For the first time that evening, silence belonged to me. The moment Edward Callahan greeted me with respect, the energy in the lobby shifted. His voice carried across the marble floor, every syllable clear enough for my mother and sister to hear. Lauren's smile faltered, her confident posture crumbling as she realized he wasn't addressing her. My mother's grip on her clutch tightened, her face caught between confusion and alarm. I answered Edward smoothly, thanking him for his kind words, and for a breath of time, silence blanketed the space. Lauren blinked rapidly, her voice breaking the pause. You know her?" she asked, looking at him as though the world had tilted. Edward glanced at her briefly before returning his focus to me. "Of course," he replied evenly. "We've collaborated on multiple developments across the country. One of the sharpest partners I've had the privilege of working with." His tone left no room for doubt. My mother's lips parted, as though she might protest, but nothing came. She finally managed Caroline. "You've worked with him?" Her words wavered, unfamiliar with this version of me standing before her. Before I could answer, Marcy stepped forward from the front desk, her timing precise. "Ms. Mercer," she said softly, "the Winston suite is prepared, the staff is ready, and your father's bourbon has been decanted as requested." She gave a small nod, then stepped back. Lauren's face drained of color. "What is going on?" she demanded, her voice sharp and unsteady. Edward turned to her, his expression calm, but edged with disapproval. "Are you family?" he asked. "I'm her sister." Lauren answered quickly. "Then I suggest you show your sister the respect her position deserves, especially in her own establishment." The weight of his words fell heavy, leaving no room for argument. At that moment, my father emerged from the bar, still laughing with two of his colleagues. He hadn't yet noticed the tension gathering in the lobby. My mother leaned closer to me, her voice hushed and urgent. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. "All this time, this place is yours." Her eyes searched mine, but I held steady. Because no one ever asked, I answered quietly. The pause that followed carried years of unspoken truth. Lauren finally turned toward the Winston suite, staring at the doors, as though seeing them for the first time, not as a rented space, but as something belonging to me. I inhaled, steadying myself, then gestured forward. "Let's not keep the guests waiting." We entered the suite together, the long dining table set with gold-rimmed plates and crisp linen napkins. Orchids and eucalyptus cascaded down the center candles, glowing softly between each place setting. My staff moved with practiced ease, greeting me with nods and quiet good evenings as they passed. Their respect was subtle but unmistakable. Lauren's eyes darted from one face to another, watching as they treated me not as a guest, but as their leader. My father reached his seat at the head of the table, still unaware of what had unfolded. Edward offered me his arm and guided me toward the chair beside him, the chair Lauren had clearly intended for herself. My father's smile wavered when he saw us approach. "Caroline," he said slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You know Edward?" I met his gaze and answered without hesitation. "Dad, Edward works for me." The room stilled once more, the air thick with disbelief. My father's brow furrowed. "You... what?" His voice cracked slightly. I straightened my shoulders, my voice calm and measured. "I own Athena on 5th, and 4 other properties." The silence stretched. Edward leaned back slightly, his tone almost playful as he added, "She's one of our top partners, Richard. Brilliant strategist. You should be proud." My father lowered himself into his chair slowly, as though the weight of the moment pressed him down. My mother remained standing, her face pale, her napkin clutched tightly in her hand. Lauren slipped into a seat near the far end of the table, her expression unreadable, her usual confidence gone. The servers entered quietly, placing the first course in front of each guest. My father looked down at the plate, then up at me. This is your recipe, isn't it?" he asked. I nodded. "It is." He lifted his fork, tasting the salmon with a slow, thoughtful motion. "It's excellent," he admitted. It was the closest thing to a compliment I had ever heard from him. Dinner continued, the courses arriving one by one, each moment layered with quiet revelations. My staff addressed me with ease, bringing the bourbon I had arranged for my father and presenting each dish with care. Around the table, guests exchanged glances, whispers, filling the spaces where laughter had been earlier. My mother smoothed her napkin nervously, finally speaking. "Why keep it from us?" she asked softly. "Why now?" I set down my fork, meeting her eyes across the table. "Because for years, being anything other than Lauren meant being dismissed," I answered. "If I had told you, I know exactly how the conversation would have gone, so I let you assume." Edward chuckled lightly, his voice carrying just enough to fill the quiet. "Your daughter's humility is remarkable, Diane. You'd be surprised how many executives claim credit for far less." My mother flushed, fumbling for words. I wasn't trying to diminish her. I didn't raise my voice, but my reply was steady. "You didn't need to try." The meal moved forward, but the balance in the room had shifted completely. Lauren kept her head down, speaking only once near dessert. "So all this time, while we thought you were working the front desk, you were doing this?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I replied. "And there's nothing wrong with that kind of work. But no, that's not where I stayed." Lauren looked away, muttering, "I didn't know." My response was simple. "You never asked." The servers placed envelopes in front of each guest, small gestures I had prepared in advance. Inside were gift certificates for weekend stays at my other properties, tokens of appreciation for those who had come to celebrate my father's birthday. Some guests smiled politely. Others avoided eye contact, uncertain how to address me now. My father lingered over his bourbon, swirling the amber liquid slowly in the glass. When the final plates were cleared, he looked across the table at me, his expression caught between pride and regret. "I always thought you'd find your way," he said. I didn't hesitate. "I never lost it, Dad. You just refused to see where it led." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He nodded, once silent. That night, for the first time, I didn't feel like the afterthought in my own family. I didn't need to fight for my seat at the table. It was already mine. As dessert was cleared from the table, the weight of the evening seemed to press more heavily on the room. Guests leaned back in their chairs, quiet glances passing between them as though they were still adjusting to what they had just learned. My staff moved with quiet precision, pouring coffee and tea while I sat steady at the head of the table beside Edward. Across from me, my father cradled his bourbon glass, staring into the amber liquid, as if the right words might be hiding there. My mother, who had always filled silence with careful chatter, seemed to lose her script. She folded and refolded her napkin, smoothing the fabric against her lap, before finally breaking the hush. "Caroline," she said softly, "you built all of this and never once told us." Her voice carried a fragile edge, part disbelief and part regret. I met her eyes across the glow of the candles. "You never asked," I said simply. The words were not harsh, but the truth within them settled heavily at the table. Lauren shifted in her seat, further down the line, her usual confidence drained. She had been quiet since her earlier exchange with Edward, but now she lifted her head, her voice low. "All this time, we thought you were still behind a desk answering phones." Her words trailed off unfinished. I nodded once. "And there is nothing wrong with that work. But no, that isn't where I stayed." Her gaze dropped back to her plate, and she didn't reply. For the first time in my life, Lauren, the sister who had always seemed untouchable, looked small in her chair. My father's brow furrowed, his thoughts finally pushing into words. 5 hotels, he muttered, as though testing the sound of it. And consulting too, Edward leaned forward with a faint smile. "Richard, she has become one of the most reliable partners in the industry. You've sat across from people who have heard her name more often than yours." The statement wasn't cruel. It was matter of fact. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He looked at me again, the corners of his eyes lined deeper than I remembered. Why keep it from us?" His voice faltered. I took a quiet breath before answering. "Because every time I tried to be anything other than what you expected, it was ignored. I knew how the conversation would go, so I let you believe what you wanted." No one spoke after that. The only sound was the clink of silverware being cleared by my staff and the faint strains of music from the quartet outside the suite. Guests began excusing themselves, some stopping briefly to congratulate me in low tones, others avoiding my gaze altogether. One by one, they filtered out until only family remained. My father stayed seated still, turning the bourbon glass slowly in his hands. At last he looked up. "I always believed you'd find your way," he said. His words were careful, as though chosen to protect his pride. I answered steadily. "I never lost my way, Dad. You just refused to see it." His lips pressed together, but he didn't protest. He gave a single nod instead, as if that small acknowledgement was all he could manage. My mother stood collecting her purse with trembling fingers. She glanced toward me, her expression softer than it had been in years. "Caroline," she said quietly, we should have asked." There was no defense, no excuse, just a thin thread of regret trailing between us. Lauren remained in her chair until the very end, silent, as she watched me gather my things. For once, she had no clever remark, no pointed jab, only stillness. When the suite finally emptied, I stepped back into the lobby. The candles there had burned low, their light flickering across the polished marble. The quartet had packed away their instruments, leaving only quiet air and the sound of my heels echoing on the floor. I walked toward the bench beneath the framed photograph from Athena's grand opening. In it, I stood alone, arms crossed before the very doors Lauren had tried to block me from earlier that evening. The irony was sharp, but it no longer stung. Marcy appeared at my side holding a folded napkin. She offered it with a faint smile. "From Leo," she said, nodding toward the head waiter. I opened it and found a single line written neatly inside. "Your family dines well, but you command the room." I closed the napkin and set it beside me, exhaling deeply. For years, being underestimated had defined me. It had shaped the choices I made, the work I poured myself into, and the silence I carried. But tonight, for the first time, that story shifted. Tonight, I no longer sat in the shadows of their assumptions. I no longer bent myself smaller to fit the version they had created of me. The night wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation. And as the doors at the far end of the lobby opened one last time, I heard the sound of familiar footsteps. Lauren stepped inside, alone, her expression softer than I had ever seen it. She paused, searching for words, then walked toward me. "I stayed behind," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of hesitation I had never heard before. "I just wanted to understand how you did all this without us." I looked at her steady and calm. "Because I had to." She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping before meeting mine again. "I underestimated you." Her words hung between us, heavy but honest. I rose from the bench, meeting her gaze. "I know." She hesitated, her hands twisting together. "Is it too late to start asking the right questions?" I didn't answer immediately. The lobby was quiet, the faint glow of candles still reflecting in the glass doors behind her. I took a step toward her, leaving the space open. "Let's walk," I said softly. Lauren and I walked side by side through the lobby, the quiet echo of our footsteps filling the space where music had once played. She kept her gaze low, at first stealing glances at the chandeliers and polished stone as though seeing them for the first time. I didn't press her. I let the silence guide us past the velvet chairs and toward the tall windows that overlooked the city. When she finally spoke, her words were halting. "I spent years thinking I knew exactly who you were," she admitted. "I thought you were just managing a front desk, maybe moving around, because you couldn't settle anywhere." She hesitated, then shook her head. "And all this time you were building something like this." I didn't respond right away. I let her words settle in the air between us. She drew in a breath and continued. "I was so sure Dad's approval mattered more than anything. I never stopped to ask what mattered to you." Her voice caught on the last word soft enough that I wondered if she even meant for me to hear it. We stopped at the tall glass doors leading to the garden. Outside, the last of the candles flickered in the cool night air, the city stretching out beyond the rooftop. Lauren's reflection in the glass looked smaller than I had ever remembered. She turned to me, her expression open for the first time. "I should have asked," she said. "I should have been your sister instead of your competition." The honesty in her words carried weight. For once there was no sharp edge, no smug grin, no attempt to take center stage. Just quiet truth. I unlocked the doors and stepped outside, the breeze brushing against my shoulders as I walked toward the railing. She followed, wrapping her arms against the chill. The garden stretched before us, every detail carefully chosen during those months of renovation. The string lights swayed gently, and the scent of lilacs lingered even this late at night. Lauren looked around slowly, her voice lower now. "Dad always said you didn't have the focus for something big." I believed him. I thought if you weren't shining the way I was, then you must have failed. Her words carried no malice, only regret. She paused, then asked softly, "How did you keep going when no one believed in you?" I turned to her, meeting her eyes, because I didn't need them to believe in me. I needed to believe in myself, The simplicity of the answer seemed to settle over her, leaving her silent again. For a while we stood at the edge of the garden and shared quiet. The city below shimmered with lights, each one a reminder of the world beyond our family's narrow vision. Finally, Lauren exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to undo years of treating you like you didn't matter," she admitted. "But if it isn't too late, I want to try." Her voice carried a sincerity I had never heard before. She looked at me not as someone to overshadow, but as someone she wanted to understand. I considered her words carefully, the memory of years of dismissal still sharp. But standing there on the rooftop of what I had built, I realized I didn't need her to erase the past. What mattered was what came next. "Then start by asking the right questions," I told her. She nodded, her expression shifting with quiet determination. "All right," she said softly. "Then tell me where it all began." We turned back towards the glow of the lobby, the weight of years still between us, but no longer insurmountable. For the first time, I felt the possibility of being seen by her not as an afterthought, but as her equal. The night wasn't over, but its meaning had already shifted. Respect had been earned, not given, and the balance in our family would never be the same again. Lauren and I lingered on the rooftop until the last of the candles burned low. For years, our conversations had been sharp and one-sided, but that night something had shifted. We didn't solve everything, not in a single evening, but we found a place to begin. When she asked questions about the early years, about the small ins and endless nights I had survived, I answered. For once, she listened. Later, as she slipped her coat around her shoulders, she paused at the doors and said quietly, "I don't want to miss your story anymore." Those words stayed with me long after she left. They weren't an apology, but they were the first step towards something better than rivalry understanding. When the hotel finally grew still, I walked through the lobby one last time. The polished marble reflected the soft glow of the sconces, the very floors I had once swept clear of broken glass. Every detail told the story of resilience, velvet drapes, restored chandeliers, art chosen with care. For years, I had built without recognition, carrying silence, heavier than stone. That night, the silence broke. My father hadn't given me the words I might have once longed for, but I no longer needed them. His nod, his quiet recognition, was enough to mark the shift. My mother's regret hung fragile, but even that was something real, something she had never offered before. And Lauren's presence, the soft cracks in her certainty, told me that change was possible even after years of dismissal. I sat down on the velvet bench beneath the photograph from Athena's reopening. In the picture, I stood alone in front of the restored doors, arms crossed, ready to carry the weight myself. That woman was still me, but she no longer needed to carry it in silence. I had proven most of all to myself that worth doesn't require validation from those who fail to see it. Being underestimated had its cost. It meant years of doubt, quiet sacrifices, and moments of loneliness that shaped me in ways I couldn't undo. But it also gave me something lasting clarity. I didn't need their approval to know my own value. I needed only the courage to stand in what I had built and let the truth speak for itself. That night, justice wasn't a dramatic unveiling. It was the steady recognition that no matter how long someone tries to define you, you have the power to define yourself. Dignity isn't granted, it's claimed. And as I finally left the hotel, the city spread out before me, I understood the lesson fully. Respect isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about standing tall when others expect you to shrink, and knowing that your story is worth telling. Thank you for listening to mine. If you've ever had to fight to be seen for who you truly are, I'd love to hear your story too. Share it in the comments, and if this journey resonated with you, stay connected for more.